Good morning. Welcome to the Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Free Press Media Press Inc., an alternative parties books publisher, sponsors this podcast. I'm Andrew Bouchard. Welcome to the Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Today, friends, we have another exciting guest on the podcast who's going to talk to us and give us intellectual stimulation and political action. And her name is Harriet Wasserstrum, and she represents ranked choice voting for Texas. So welcome to the podcast, Harriet.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Harriet, if we can get started by you kindly giving us an introduction to yourself, a brief biographical sketch.
Okay. I am a retired banker. I worked as a banker for 27 years and then retired. And then I ran a nonprofit called the American Leadership Forum in Houston, which really builds relationships among different types of leaders within the community. So I did that for 11 years.
Okay.
And then I retired from that, was doing a bunch of pro bono stuff, and I decided I was totally fed up with our political landscape, and I had never been involved in politics other than voting, and I started looking for a way to make a difference, because otherwise I decided I had to stop reading newspapers or listening to the news on TV because it was just too upsetting. So I decided I either had to stop complaining or I had to try to do something about it. And I contacted Fair Vote, which is I think the best national advocacy group for ranked choice voting. And they matched me up with someone else from Texas who was interested in starting an operation here. And we started ranked choice voting for Texas in 2019. So it's been 4 years.
Okay, so you're the founder. Background. You're the founder of Ranked Choice Voting for Texas, then, right?
Co-founder. I had a partner with me.
Oh, okay, cool.
Who has since gotten too busy with family and work. So we have lots of other volunteers who have filled in behind her.
Okay, great. That sounds like a good setup for your organization. So kindly tell us the mission of Ranked Choice Voting for Texas.
We are single-minded. We have a single focus, and that is to get Texas to enact ranked choice voting. We do not have citizens ballot initiative capability in Texas, so if we want to change the way we vote, the legislature must pass it. And we have a pretty right-leaning legislature whose initial reaction is against ranked choice voting. So we don't want to get involved with any other electoral reform. We think that ranked choice voting by itself might actually get adopted by the legislature, and by itself it can have a positive impact on our political landscape.
Okay.
So that is our goal, to get ranked choice voting enacted. I can tell you a little bit about what we've done since 2019, if you'd like.
Yes, perfect.
So the Texas legislature meets for 5 months in alternate years. So our first legislative session was in 2021, and we were advocating for 3 separate bills. One to enact ranked choice voting so that military and overseas voters would not be disenfranchised by delays in receiving runoff ballots. One was for primaries, political party primaries, and one was for nonpartisan local elections. And the latter 2 bills had been filed by the legislature of the prior session and never got a hearing. When we started getting involved in it, we started advocating for those 3 bills. The military and overseas voter bill got a hearing and was passed by the full House, but made it over to the Senate too late to get enacted. So that was the 2021 session. We started 2023 thinking, this is great, we'll just pick up where we left off. But instead, the Republican National Committee came out with a policy statement that all states should ban ranked choice voting in all elections.
Yuck.
So we spent the 2023 session just fighting the ban bill, which we were successful in doing, which to me was nothing to brag about. We had hoped we'd make positive progress. Instead, all we did was prevent negative. negative turn of events. But not all states were that lucky, and a couple of extra states decided to ban all ranked choice voting. So we are now preparing for the 2025 session, and we really did learn a lot by working hard to ban the bill early. And I keep saying last year, but it was really early this year. The session was from January through May of 2023. So we really learned a lot from that process. We got some help from some out-of-state Republicans who really like ranked choice voting.
Oh.
And in the process of discussing ranked choice voting with the legislators, we really have come up with some different spins on what we might introduce in 2025, and that's what we're working on now.
Okay. That's
so
good.
It's been an interesting learning experience for me, and I think one big challenge that we have is that most people still don't know what ranked choice voting is.
Yes. So kindly tell our audience how you define it.
Okay, so I was just waiting for your siren to stop. Okay, so ranked choice voting would be for us a change in voting logistics, and it is totally nonpartisan. It sometimes helps Republicans. It sometimes helps Democrats. It always helps either nominate in a primary or elect in a general election a candidate who has broad voter support. And to me, that is really the key. It is nonpartisan, and you get broadly supported winners. And I think that if we can get broadly supported winners, then chances are the animosity and the acrimony in our legislature would decrease, and we'd be able to actually work on issues that need attention instead of just taking, I'm on team red or team blue and let's just fight.
Sure.
So ranked choice voting is a change in voting logistics. What happens is instead of voting for a single candidate, voters have the option of ranking, and it depends on the election. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 5, but a certain number of the candidates. And then the votes are counted, first choices are tallied. If someone receives the majority of the first choice votes, they win. If no one receives a majority of the first choice votes, then the lowest vote getting candidate is eliminated, and those votes get redistributed to each voter's second choice, each of those voters' second choice who voted for that candidate. And then they count again. Does someone have a majority? If someone has a majority, they're the winner. If no one has a majority, then you eliminate the next lowest vote getter and reallocate those votes to their backup choices and see if you have a winner. So you go through the process until someone has the majority of the votes then remaining, and that will be someone who received a bunch of people's first choice votes, but some people's second or even third or fourth choice votes, depending on how many tallies you have to go through. And if you have a lot of candidates, then chances are you have to go through more rounds to eliminate them. But that's how ranked choice voting works. It was really introduced into the United States in around 2004 by San Francisco. It's now used in 60 cities around the country. It's used by 2 states for most of their elections. And it's used in other ways depending on where it was enacted. So, for example, I like to point out that 6 southern states have adopted ranked choice voting for military and overseas voters, because when I talk to people in the military and ask them how voting goes for them when they're stationed overseas, when they get a ballot in the mail, they send it back. If there's a runoff, they never get the runoff ballot in time, or they get it before the runoff date, but they're never convinced it's actually received in their home county. And we really don't want to disenfranchise military voters.
Sure.
It's a very important body. There aren't a lot of them, but they deserve to be able to vote. The 6 southern states have adopted ranked choice voting just for military and overseas voters, which I think is great. It was the bill that we actually got through the House, one of our chambers, in 2021. So that's an easy use. It's really nice because I feel it's really doing something good for those military and overseas voters. But in the huge state of Texas, we only have 86,000 voters like that. And it's because only so few voters are affected by it, it really doesn't change the nature of campaigns. One of the things that really attracted me to ranked choice voting in the first place is that I was reading that it makes campaigns more civil. And if you think about it, if I'm running for an office against you, and you have a bunch of supporters, and I know they really like you, but I want them to rank me as their second choice, I'm not likely to say really nasty things about you because then your supporters won't rank me second. So there's been analysis, literally word analysis of positive and negative words. And in campaigns that are run using ranked choice voting, the level of civility increases. And to me, that's really important.
Interesting. I never heard that thing about using it for overseas voters. I didn't picture it as something that could be done for part of an election, but not the whole election. So
it's very clever. Let me explain how it works. So
okay.
if you live in Mississippi, and Mississippi has ranked choice voting for overseas and military voters, what they do is when they send you your initial ballot, they send you two ballots. One looks just like the ballot that everyone back in your home county has received. The second ballot is a ranked choice voting ballot. The voter fills out both ballots, mails them in a single envelope. When the envelope gets to their county, their home county, the election administrator only opens the ballot that looks just like everyone else's back home. In the event of a runoff, they then open the second ballot, and they know how you voted in a runoff because you ranked all the candidates. So if your third and fifth sources are the two guys who are in the runoff, they know that you would vote for number 3 and not for number 5. I think it's very clever. And several of the southern states that use it initially adopted it just because they didn't want to. There was a new federal regulation for military voters that said you can't send runoff ballots to overseas voters earlier than 45 days off after the regular election. And some of the southern states didn't want to change their election calendar, so instead they came up with this solution. So I think it's really very clever. And what you know about it, you may not realize you know about it, because Georgia passed a ranked choice voting for military and overseas law at the beginning of 2022. So if you remember in 2020, the whole country, sat around waiting to see what was going to happen in those 2 Senate races because there was no majority winner in those 2 Senate races, and Georgia requires, for U.S. Senate, requires a majority winner. So we didn't know if the Senate would wind up being Democratic or Republican until those 2 seats resolved. And the election was in November. The runoff election wasn't until January. So everyone in the country sat around waiting to see was the Senate going to be Democratic majority or Republican majority as we waited for the result. In 2022, there was another Senate race in Georgia that did not result in a majority winner, but that runoff election was held in December. They didn't have to wait that long because they had They didn't have to wait that long. They didn't have to wait that long because they had already provided to their military and overseas voters that second ballot, which you could open up because it was received at the same time as the initial ballot.
Okay.
So we knew who was going to win in December. So it really, although it's geared to impact military and overseas voters, it wound up impacting everyone because the runoff election could be held earlier.
Okay. Did you hear any feedback from how the overseas and military voters liked the ballot and understood the ballot? Or did you not hear anything about that yet?
So I'm in Texas, so our voters don't use it yet because only one of our chambers passed the bill.
Okay.
But when we were trying to get ready to advocate for the bill, I talked to people in other states, and they like it. And in fact, it was really funny. We now have a new volunteer for ranked choice voting for Texas who had been living elsewhere and actually had used, and he's an ex-military guy, and he had been talking to people he knew who were still overseas. So he
Oh,
had really positive things to say about how it was now working. And
okay.
most voters in the United States, once they try using ranked choice voting, they say, oh, it's not that hard. You know, there's really a lot of misinformation that gets promulgated by people who, for some reason or another, do not want us to implement ranked choice voting. But if you do surveys after an election of voters who just use ranked choice voting, say, that wasn't hard, that was simple, and I want to use it again. By far, an overwhelming majority of people who use ranked choice voting once like it and want to use it again. It is not confusing.
Well, that's good. So what type of misinformation are they putting forth, and how would you refute that?
Well, I've already told you one thing, which is they say it's too complicated, and I'll give you an example that I really like. When New York City adopted ranked choice voting, gosh, I'm losing track of time. Maybe it was must have been in 2021. So the NAACP said you cannot use it in the election for mayor that's coming up because our voters will be at a disadvantage because they're not going to understand what has to get done. You're disenfranchising African American voters in New York City.
Oh my.
And they didn't win their suit to delay the election. The election took place, and the exit polls showed that there was absolutely no difference across ethnicities as to who found it easy to use and whether or not they wanted to use it again.
Good.
And the guy who ran the NAACP had to apologize because he was really saying something that wasn't very nice about his voters, about his supporters.
Exactly.
So, that's the example that I like to use. People, it's not that hard. You know, people always say, okay, ranked choice voting is just like you go into an ice cream store and, you wanted to get a mint chocolate chip cone, but out of mint chocolate chip, what are you going to do? You're not going to go home. You have a backup choice. People rank things all the time, and it's no different for candidates than it is for ice cream or anything else that we rank in our lives.
Okay.
Not that hard.
Earlier, I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, I just said it's not that hard.
True. So earlier we were talking about how your organization is singular focused on ranked choice voting. So I'm wondering, does that entail that you don't take stances on similar things to ranked choice voting, like a star voting or approval voting, or is that you're more referring to the reforms of an entirely different nature, such as popular voting and campaign finance reform?
All of the above.
Okay.
So the reason we like ranked choice voting as opposed to star voting or approval voting or anything else is that ranked choice voting has a track record. It's been used in about 650 elections in the United States over the last 20 years. And approval voting has been used in 2 elections in the United States. And, it's easier to sell something that has such a strong track record of success.
Okay.
Approval voting is used by, universities, in lots of different settings, but it hasn't been used for public elections. And I think we need to rely on a track record. So that's why we focus on ranked choice voting. It's not perfect, but then again, neither is approval voting or star voting or anything else. Each mechanism of voting, including the way we currently vote with first past the post, has its pluses and minuses. I truly believe that in the case of ranked choice voting, it gets rid of a lot of the worst things that happen with first past the post, which is what we use today. And it's really quite good and will make a difference because you always get a candidate elected who has broad voter support. And to me, that's what democracy is all about. I don't want fringe candidates because they're not likely to enact legislation that will make me happy or run a city or a state or a country. I just think that broadly, if someone has positions that enables them to attract more than half of the people who are voting, that's got to be a good thing in my mind. And
Sure.
that just reminded me, one use of ranked choice voting that I didn't mention, which I really should have, is in the 2020 election, 5 states use ranked choice voting for the Democratic presidential primary.
Oh.
And a couple of more states will use it in 2024 that we know about already, and a couple of others may still get there. And to me, that's such a great use of ranked choice voting because I worked the polls in I don't know, why do I get confused? In 2020, and there were a bunch of people who showed up on primary election day who said, I am so glad that I did not vote by mail, because if I had voted by mail, I might have voted for Amy Klobuchar. And she backed out of being a candidate the night before the primary day.
Oh, wow.
So all of those, there were a bunch of candidates. Amy Klobuchar was one of them. But several candidates decided they put all of their endorsements to Joe Biden, and all of the people who had sent in early ballots and had voted for other candidates who were no longer on the ballot, their votes were just thrown away. Whereas if they had submitted a ranked choice voting ballot, then their vote could have been distributed to their second choice and their vote would still count. That's a really nice benefit that comes in when you talk about, again, many candidates on the ballot.
Yes, that sounds like a good argument in favor of ranked choice voting.
So let me go back to your first case. When I say we're single targeted, single focused, so ranked choice voting versus any other voting system, we think it's far better than what we have today, and there isn't anything else that has a proven track record. And then we don't want to talk about other electoral reforms because we don't need millions of Texans to support ranked choice voting as we would if we had a citizens ballot initiative.
Oh, okay.
We need a few dozen elected officials to be convinced that ranked choice voting is good. And if we start advocating for other electoral reforms, chances are we're going to lose some people. So we have no opinion on open primaries. You know, I might have a personal opinion, but our organization only takes a position on ranked choice voting because by itself, we really believe it can have a positive impact.
Sure. That seems like that's good for an organization to do, I hear, is to have a focus. You don't want to get diluted, you don't want to get distracted, you don't want to waste your resources. So that's all people say when you don't focus. So it's good that you're focused.
Yep.
So what do you think about Austin voting in favor of ranked choice voting?
I think it's great, but they can't implement it until the state legislature approves it.
Okay.
So they are all set to go. If we had been able to pass the nonpartisan local election bill, then Austin, in its next election, could use ranked choice voting. Right now, they have to wait until the state legislature enacts that before they can use ranked choice voting. And in fact, the ballot initiative explicitly said that. It said we will adopt ranked choice voting as soon as it becomes legal to do so in the state.
Okay.
The bill is referred to as a trigger ordinance, and there are several other communities that are in the process of doing a trigger ordinance. You know, we would like to have a bunch of other city, state, school boards, whatever, be ready to go as soon as the state legislature approves it. So, yeah, I think it's great that Austin did it. Austin, in fact, let me take a step back here. So ranked choice voting is not explicitly illegal in Texas. It's just not explicitly legal.
Huh.
So what happened was in 2001, the city of Austin wanted to use ranked choice voting to elect their to run their local election. And the Secretary of State said, in your local election, you need a majority winner. And ranked choice voting does not produce a majority winner. Because in their mind, it doesn't matter if I become a majority because I have a combination of first, second, and other backup votes. And most voters, like me, they say majority means first choice have to have more than 50%. So they said you can't use ranked choice voting because it's not consistent with what is in the Texas election code. And that opinion by the Secretary of State in 2001 was reaffirmed by the Attorney General in 2003. And we haven't used ranked choice voting since. It's never been tested in the courts for a variety of reasons. In other states, the constitutionality of ranked choice voting has been tested in their courts, and it's always been found to be acceptable. So you have to be careful about how you word the law that puts it into place, but it's perfectly legal. I'm glad that Austin decided to do it again 20 years later, and we just need the state legislature to explicitly add to the Texas election code that use of ranked choice voting is permitted. That's what we're working.
So it sounds like the most efficient strategy is to go for the state area rather than get into each community, because you have to have the state approve it anyways. So before anything gets done.
That's right. And some city charters will require a charter amendment even after the state approves it. And that's what Austin was getting a jump on. Because there's also language in their city charter about how elections are held. So really, action has to take place in some localities, but they can't do anything until the state first approves it. They can't implement it until the state approves it.
Okay. So how does your organization get the word out about your message?
Well, we have a website and we have a presence in social media. We now have about 3,500 supporters on our website. We encourage anyone who signs up on our website to share that information with their friends and family. Some people do, most people don't. I mean, life has too many other things going on for most people. But it's really a lot of word of mouth. We've had some media exposure, but not much. So people sometimes read articles about the implementation of ranked choice voting in other communities and other states. Sometimes they read positive stuff if it's from people who've actually done it. Sometimes they read negative stuff. It comes from people who are afraid that they lose control and therefore aren't interested in implementing it. But I know that when I work the polls, and my first question when I approach a voter standing in line is, have you heard about ranked choice voting? And it's interesting to me that a lot of people still have never heard of it. And I love explaining what it is, and most people say, oh, that makes sense. So we just, our big challenges are educating legislators so they're not worried that somehow it will adversely affect them individually, and then educating lots of citizens. So our basic strategy is to educate voters and then have them contact their elected officials and say, I support ranked choice voting, and when a bill is being considered by the legislature, I hope you vote for it.
Okay.
So again, we have a website, we try to get media coverage and have social media and word of mouth. And that's how we get the word out.
Sounds good. Speaking of which, how can our audience look at your website? What's the address?
rcv4texas.org.
rcvtexas.org. Okay.
rcv4texas.org. FORTEXAS.org. rcvfortexas.org.
Okay. And what's the handle for social media?
We have a presence on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, or whatever it's called now, X, and LinkedIn. We had been posting a lot of messages throughout the legislative session that ended at the end of May. We're in the process of rebuilding our social media team, so we're going to resume that sort of posting soon. But we had a pretty consistent presence in social media.
Good.
And it's usually RCV for Texas.
Okay. So the handle is standard across the different platforms.
Yep.
Okay. All right, great. Harriet, we thank you for coming on the podcast today and talking about ranked choice voting in your organization and what it's doing.
Okay, happy to do that.
All right, we wish you all the best with the organization and everything you do in your personal and professional life.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, take care and all the best.
Okay, bye.